we see that Odessa's name is appearing twice. So could we ask the second Odessa to change the name to the speaker so that everyone can see who's speaking? If you need assistance, let us know. Type the name in the chat box and we can do it manually for you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining back in to our second panel on smuggling. will not introduce the panel, but I will instead introduce our panel's moderator, Marzia Rango, to introduce this session and the speakers. Marzia is the Data Innovation and Capacity Building Coordinator at the Global Migration Data and Analysis Center, GMDAC, at IOM in Berlin. Thank you very much, Marzia, and over to you.
Thanks very much to you, Ayla, for this introduction, and many thanks to all of you at the Mixed Migration Center and UNHCR for the invitation to what I must say is already a very rich workshop so far. I would like to also extend a warm welcome to all of the speakers and all attendees in this panel discussion, which I have the pleasure to moderate. The panel focuses on smuggling policies, and various actors involved, intermediaries, people on the move, and local communities, and also their relations and interactions. And so we will shortly listen to 3 presentations, which will provide very different, or actually different perspectives, but complementary perspectives as well on human smuggling. So let me first briefly introduce our panel. First, we will hear from Ana Maria Murphy-Teixidor, who is a research specialist at the North Africa Regional Office of the Mixed Migration Center. And her work focuses primarily on quantitative analysis on themes of protection, labor market integration, and smuggling in Libya. And her presentation will provide a route-based perspective on non-Libyan smugglers operating en route to and also within Libya. We will then hear from José Dogma Tebou, who is the 4MI, or Mixed Migration Monitoring Mechanism Initiative of the Mixed Migration Center Monitor based in Tunis. José will provide her views of smuggling networks and also the use of smuggling services based on her work on the ground as a 4MI monitor. Last but not least, we'll have a group of speakers and a joint presentation from first of all, Dr. Odessa Gonzalez Benson, who is assistant professor at the University of Michigan School of Social Work and Detroit School of Urban Studies, together with Imed Sultani, who is the president of the association La Terre pour tous, which since 2011 fights to prevent migrant deaths and disappearances in the Mediterranean, and also to bring bodies back home. They will also be joined by Bader Al-Bader, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan College of Urban Planning, Marwen Saidi, and Gemma Baccini, who are both volunteers at the Association La Terre pour tous. And the presentation will go through the results, very interesting results of their active participatory research, exploring Tunisian ties between smugglers and local communities, and particularly when it comes to the issue of missing migrants and families searching for their loved ones. The presentation will be followed by a discussion, so I would invite you all to please post your questions in the Q&A section right below or in the chat box, selecting all panelists or all participants. Otherwise, you can also raise your hand and directly ask your questions and make any comments in the discussion session. This is also possible for all attendees. We can make attendees panelists to directly ask their questions. We will leave all the questions at the end, but for any immediate reactions or clarifications, please feel free to use the chat box or the Q&A box below. Also, maybe just a reminder that the panel is being live streamed, as you may have seen on YouTube, and the live stream will continue for the discussion session. So if you were in the also panel this morning, you might have heard that the live stream will continue by popular demand, I hear. So this will not be happening under Chatham House rules. And last, just a quick note for the speakers, and also a reminder to self, because we have interpretation services available. And so please do not speak too quickly to facilitate also the work of the interpreters. So without further ado, I'll now hand over to Ana Maria for the first presentation. Ana Maria, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Marzia. I'm going to try to share my screen now. We have a small presentation for some visual aids. Slideshow and play from start. So everyone can see my screen now, is that correct?
Yes.
And hear me well? Great. So today I'll be presenting some MMC research, and as Marzia already noticed, the title of this research is Understanding the Intra-Network Dynamics for Non-Libyan Smuggling Intermediaries Working Along Libya's Western Migration Corridor. And just to give you a background on some of our rationale for this research, basically a lot of the research which is done on the smuggling sector in Libya to date has really principally focused on Libyan actors. And we've seen smuggling and trafficking vis-a-vis local governance and the conflict economy. And this background really is key, but when we undertake MMC data collection which is with refugees and migrants across the region, much of what we see when we ask refugees and migrants who a smuggler is to them and ask them different perceptions related to smuggling, what we see is that a lot of times when they refer to their smuggler, they're actually talking about non-Libyan smugglers, and these are really a key actor for refugees and migrants along their journey. So while we know that these smuggling intermediaries are known to take part in the migrant recruitment and movement facilitation, we know relatively less about how the intra-network dynamics and their varied roles within the networks operate. So this piece really looks to centralize thinking around what are the different relationships among smugglers and how have social and demographic factors affected the structure and nature of these intra-network dynamics within Libya. And just one small caveat before I get into the presentation, I think throughout we are really looking at these intra-network dynamics, and we speak a little bit less to some of the key protection challenges along the route. And this is something that other MMC research really touches on. So I'd really point you to the detention study and the vulnerability study along with the joint MMC and UNHCR report, which also shows that smugglers are a key perpetrator of violence along this route. So this is not to negate that as well. So I'll start with giving a brief overview of the policy and legal framework in Libya. First, looking at international policy frameworks, something that's already been touched on a lot in the morning sessions is the 2000 UN Protocol on the Smuggling of Migrants by Land, Sea, and Air. This protocol really defines smuggling as the procurement in order to obtain directly or indirectly a financial or other material gain for the illegal entry of a person into a state which the person is not a national or permanent resident of. And so those really look, this framework really looks at those operating within their own nationality or within their own state and who have the protections which is allowed to them, and looking at the material benefits linked to smuggling. So it really doesn't account for this potential difference of non-nationals operating within a different space. And looking at then the regional policy frameworks, we see that the EU for their Operation Sophia and Irini have also taken on this definition from the protocol, and they look to enforce this definition in order to contribute to the disruption of the business model of human smuggling and trafficking networks. Then looking locally, Libya actually ratified the UN Protocol on Smuggling of Migrants by Land, Sea, and Air in 2004. But there's no laws pertaining specifically to smuggling. But important for the context of this presentation is the laws relating to migrants in Libya. So I'll quickly go over those. So the first, law number 6, and this really details that immigration-related infractions that carry penalties or fines or imprisonment. And while some of these actions are not specifically or directly smuggling related, so it looks at entering the country or residing in it illegally, violating different conditions and regulations of a visa or overstaying visas or remaining in the country after being ordered to leave. But actually, some are slightly more related to smuggling, so it also criminalizes the provision of false information and documents. And the other law that is quite important in the Libyan context is the 2010 law, law number 19, which looks to combat irregular migration. And this one seeks to say that the illegal migrant will be put in jail or condemned to forced labor for a fine of up to 1,000 Libyan dinars, and that the person can be expelled from the Libyan territory once they finish their time in prison. And the main point here is to say that most policy frameworks at the national, regional, and global level do little to distinguish between the various roles in migrant smuggling. So then looking at how smuggling networks are informed in Libya can really help us to provide some background for our understanding around these key dynamics. And I'll first talk a little bit at the macro level, and the NewMed Research Network detailed that prior to 2011, before the fall of Gaddafi, the players in the smuggling network were organized in a large variety of ways in Libya. It was more of a free-for-all, so there were these structural criminal groups, but there was also more of these individual and occasional smugglers. And there's limited quantitative data on smuggling in general, so this is really from some more qualitative inquiry. But Paolo Campano's research, which I have the photo up here of one of his network analyses on smuggling across the Mediterranean. In his paper, Out of Africa, the Organization of Migrant Smuggling Across the Mediterranean provides one of the best analyses we have to date on some quantitative network analysis around smuggling networks, and particularly ones in Libya. And so following the 2013 Lampedusa tragedy, he was able to get 3 different types of data to kind of work out different modeling strategies around smuggling networks. So the first piece of data that he used is the transcripts of wiretap telephone conversation between smugglers. So he can really notice also a connection between 2 different people. Then they also use testimonies collected from migrants following their arrival to Sicily, and also some different background information from legal cases after warrants for arrests were issued. And overall, this mapping presented here covers 292 different actors within the smuggling network. And this research really has 2 key findings. First is that there was not like a complete control across the route with just one person being centrally in charge, but rather that there was a series of networks. And so what we see here is that these are transnational entities, but created by these small and medium-sized organizations rather than one complete network. And the other key finding that he had was that quantitative analysis offered a clear difference between the organizers and the aides. And he has these 2 separate categories, which we'll talk a little bit about later. And that much of the stratification across who constitutes an organizer or an aide is task-based. So organizers are seen as individuals who give orders but do not receive them. So they're really the decision makers in the smuggling rings. And aides, on the other hand, are individuals who receive the orders and are highly dependent on the organizers. And to get a sense of kind of what percentage of people within the smuggling networks at the time were considered organizers or aides, he hypothesizes that approximately 15% of the actors were the organizers, whereas 85% were more in this aid position. And what another key finding from this research was that also that there was a lot of vertical coordination here rather than just horizontal indication. And this is to say that the organization takes a place across types of roles. So that organizers will give aides directives rather than organizers speaking to each other. And so this also is a key factor in thinking about smuggling in Libya, because this will also suggest that organizers are independent of each other and also then generate competition along different routes. And one geographically interesting point also that came up in this piece, that the 2 actors who were kind of seen as the most centrally located within the smuggling networks and connected to the most people were both coded as organizers, and they were both based within Tripoli. And one key caveat here is also that there was no nationality data available. There is some nationality data, but not for each of the points. So it's more difficult to make some kind of key findings from the way that nationality really contributed to the stratification. And this is something to be explored. And this is something that the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime has had some qualitative work, which really complements that quantitative work. So they go beyond this kind of organizer and aid role, and they've separated the smuggling networks in Libya within 3 main categories. So we have logisticians and specialists and the recruiters or the connection men. And here, the recruiters are really the front face of the migrant smuggling industry. They come in contact with the migrants and refugees themselves, and they're at this outer ring. So these are the cell phones and the houses on the outside ring here. And whereas the logisticians are more likely to be permanent members of the smuggling team and really coordinate the operations. And these are the two main key positions within the smuggling industry, is what GITOC hypothesizes. But then there is also this more ancillary role, which is these specialists. And these are hired often at an ad hoc basis for access or specific skills for counterfeit markets and things like that. And the last sort of hypotheses around the way that smuggling is organized in Libya, although these are mostly complementary, is Peter Tinti and Tuesday Reitano's book, Migrant Refugee Smuggler Savior. And they say that, that these smuggling networks are largely organized in this layered pyramid scheme. And the majority of the smuggling networks within the country follow this scheme. And so we have these high-level coordinators on top, and these are really the financiers of the operations. They look for access at departure sites, and they bribe authorities at the larger scale. Then we have these managers, which ensure safe houses, a steady supply of boats for sea departures and day-to-day operations, and then these intermediaries, which are key players on the move. And Tinti and Reitano also stress this point that we see within MMC, that these are really the people that people refer to as their smuggler, or migrants refer to as their smuggler when they're on the move. And one interesting piece that they noted was that migrants' perceptions of their experience, whether positive or negative, are shaped considerably by their brokers or intermediaries, despite the fact that the brokers are the most interchangeable and least specialized part of the entire industry. And so here again, I mean, we can make the note on protection that smugglers and particularly these intermediaries are both can both be perpetrators, but also can offer protection in other ways. And so getting a little bit into the MMC work. So this is really a preliminary piece of research, and which we hope will deepen our future work on smugglers. So it really helps us conceptualize how we see smugglers, how we define smuggling internally, and how we'll continue to work as and qualify these terms and continue to analyze these networks across Libya. So largely this piece pulls from 24 in-depth semi-structured interviews conducted by MMC between November 2018 and April 2019. And while previous accounts really draw on this pyramid structure that I just touched upon from Tinti and Reitano's work, we see that these high-level coordinators are mostly spoken about that they're operating out of Tripoli and other coastal cities. As these areas for the sea departure, this is a more logistically heavy task, and that these pyramid schemes and higher level of coordination was really needed at the coastal cities and at the capital. And across this evaluation, we really looked at 3 steps of the journey. So we looked from Agadez to Sabha through Morzuk usually, and then from Sabha to the coastal cities, and then from the coastal cities across the Mediterranean. And one of the key elements that we saw come out was that the interviews in the south of the country, we noted that there was this larger stratification occurring given increasing border control. So these shifts in dynamics in the south of the country kind of dictated the need for a higher level of coordination. And so one smuggler based in Sabha noted that prior to 2016, the flow of migration was much more free and easier through the desert. And ever since 2016, the Niger government is after the different drivers who are helping facilitate movement, and the freedom of movement of these intermediaries has been limited. And one smuggler even noted on the different protection elements that the soldiers who previously had been protecting movement are now more likely to be what he said was the enemy of movement. So even opening fire onto different convoys of vehicles. So we're running out of time, so I'll quickly just go to my recommendation slide, but I'm happy to further discuss these later in the session. But we've come up with a few different implications for programming. The first is really to acknowledge these shifting identities, that smugglers have different profiles, and it really warrants a nuanced policy approach. Secondly is the increase of data and availability, and this is also something that we're working on here at MMC. And then the last two, to move away from security and containment focused policies and to facilitate movement. And this pairs well with to move towards increasing legal pathways for movement as well. So with that, I'll pass it over to Jose.
Maybe I will take briefly the floor. Thanks very much, Anna Maria, for this presentation and for sticking to the time as well. I would have lots of follow-up questions, but perhaps we will leave those to the end in the interest of time, and we move on to the next presentation by José Tomga Tebu. José, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bonsoir, je vais essayer de vous parler des passeurs par rapport à nos enquêtes sur le terrain avec le centre de migration mixte. Alors, les passeurs sont des personnes migrantes aussi, pour la plupart, qui ont décidé de s'investir dans cette activité pour pouvoir essayer de trouver des voies et moyens pour pouvoir compléter leur voyage, finir leur voyage. Donc, ils peuvent être aussi des personnes qui sont locales dans le pays où ils exercent. Ils sont généralement en réseau, ils travaillent généralement pas seuls. Ils interviennent à l'intérieur du pays comme à l'intérieur d'une région bien déterminée, c'est-à-dire un ensemble de plusieurs pays côte à côte. Ils sont aussi des personnes qui peuvent travailler sur de plus grandes zones, donc c'est-à-dire ils peuvent intervenir à la fois dans un pays et dans un autre pays et même dans certains continents. Alors, le profil, ce sont des personnes, comme j'ai dit, on a essayé de distinguer deux phases. Il y a des négociateurs et des passeurs proprement dit. Les négociateurs ils travaillent essentiellement pour fournir des clients, pour chercher les clients, et ils vont aller négocier, ils vont s'occuper de la négociation et puis de convaincre les personnes pour emprunter ces chemins-là, et puis de passer la main au passeur proprement dit qui va essayer maintenant d'organiser le voyage. Les pays des passeurs, généralement rencontrés en Tunisie, pour la plupart, ce sont des Ivoiriens, ce sont des Nigériens, ce sont des Maliens, des Guinéens et des Camerounais, pour la plupart. Mais il y a aussi d'autres, quelques-uns qui sont de la RDC, du Sénégal, du Comore, du Nigeria, de la Somalie et du Tchad. Comment est-ce qu'ils s'organisent, ces passeurs-là, dans leur travail? Oh, désolée. Il y a des passeurs qui travaillent seuls, c'est-à-dire ils s'occupent, c'est généralement pas des passeurs influents parce qu'ils s'occupent des petits trajets et juste de chercher eux-mêmes leurs personnes, leurs clients, on va dire comme ça, et de les faire passer d'une zone à une autre, et ça s'arrête là. Mais il y a d'autres passeurs qui travaillent beaucoup plus en réseau, et un réseau tellement étendu, c'est-à-dire ils vont engager des négociateurs qui vont aller convaincre les clients, comme je l'ai dit plus tôt. Ils vont s'occuper aussi de bien organiser le voyage de long en large, et même essayer de rentrer en contact aussi avec certaines personnes qui sont déjà dans certaines administrations, c'est-à-dire les personnes, par exemple, de la police, les personnes, par exemple, de la garde-côte, des choses comme ça, de la marine, pour mieux organiser et pour que le voyage n'échoue pas. Et ils ont vraiment besoin de ces alliés-là. Et voilà, ils mettent ces personnes-là en contact avec eux. Alors, les négociateurs, on les voit toujours généralement comme des passeurs, mais ils sont là que pour chercher les clients. Ils ne sont pas eux-mêmes des passeurs généralement. Ils sont que négociateurs. Alors, la stratégie des passeurs. Ils insistent sur les négociateurs parce que c'est le négociateur qui va essayer de cibler quels sont les clients dont ils ont besoin pour pouvoir les convaincre facilement. Donc, le négociateur va aller dans un pays cible. Généralement, ces pays, ce sont des pays qui sont instables, des pays qui ont vécu la guerre ou qui ont vécu des événements catastrophiques où les gens ne se sentent pas en sécurité, qui ont envie de chercher mieux ailleurs. Et ils vont aussi aller chercher des personnes qui n'ont pas un grand niveau d'éducation, qu'on peut facilement mentir ou berner. Les personnes qui n'ont pas un grand niveau scolaire. Et ils vont aussi chercher des personnes qui sont instables psychologiquement parlant, pour pouvoir mieux les convaincre de voyager au travers d'eux, moyennant une somme d'argent. Et les tranches d'âge des personnes que les passeurs cherchent, c'est des personnes très jeunes. Généralement, on a remarqué, c'est entre 15 et 40 ans. Mais il y a aussi certains de 50 ans. Alors, les personnes qui sont capables de bien travailler, les personnes qui sont physiquement fortes, les personnes qui sont entre guillemets en bonne santé, qui sont capables de payer, autre que d'argent, de payer aussi différemment, c'est-à-dire en travaillant, c'est-à-dire en travaillant moyennant sur un travail. Alors, des personnes aussi qui sont, pour des filles, des personnes qui sont très, très jeunes, de plus en plus, parce qu'après, ça peut être une ressource d'argent, c'est-à-dire on peut les faire des travaux qui ne sont pas du tout, voilà, la prostitution, voilà, si on doit dire les choses clairement. Alors, les passeurs aussi, on a remarqué qu'ils se divisent souvent en petits groupes, c'est-à-dire ils sont un même réseau, mais ils se repartissent en petits groupes pour pouvoir mieux estorquer les personnes qui viennent vers eux. Ils travaillent pour la plupart en réseau, mais ils vont faire croire aux clients qu'ils ne travaillent pas avec ces personnes-là, mais ils s'associent avec ces personnes-là pour pouvoir mieux estorquer les clients. Alors, comment est-ce qu'ils se déplacent? Alors, les passeurs, jusqu'ici, on a remarqué qu'il y a beaucoup qui viennent en avion. Jusqu'ici, il y en a beaucoup qui viennent en avion jusqu'en Tunisie, mais après, qui vont continuer le trajet en bateau. Il y a d'autres qui se déplacent pour pouvoir arriver ici, par exemple en Afrique du Nord. Il y en a qui se déplacent en camion, en train, en autobus, des fois même qui sont obligés de marcher. Il y a d'autres qui voyagent uniquement par avion du pays de départ jusqu'au pays d'arrivée. Il y a certains qui voyagent aussi essentiellement à pied, tout le trajet, et surtout pour traverser certaines frontières, même quand ils sont en autobus ou en car ou en camion, ils sont obligés de descendre pour aller à pied. On a relevé quelques frontières qui sont essentielles, la Libye, la frontière de la Libye et la Tunisie, la frontière de l'Algérie, Tunisie, Maroc, Algérie, Mauritanie, Mali, Algérie, Tchad, Niger, Soudan, Libye. Alors, les risques pendant les voyages. On a remarqué qu'il y avait beaucoup d'incidents. Il y avait des gens qui étaient arrêtés pour faux et usage de faux. Il y en a qui se font refouler par rapport à l'entrée sur le territoire qui n'est pas justifiée. Escroquerie, il y en avait beaucoup. Agression, il y en a énormément. Des vols, des viols, pour beaucoup plus des filles. Mais il y a aussi des garçons qui ont été victimes de viols. Des détentions, des tortures, de l'esclavagisme, des chantages et même d'autres qui se font tuer. Alors, les marches sont très épuisantes selon les témoignages, des fois sous des températures extrêmes. Pour ceux qui marchent dans le désert, des fois, il y a des voyages qui se passent pour la plupart du temps la nuit, avec des températures incroyables. Et même, des fois, il faut faire les voyages le jour. Il n'y a pas d'eau, il n'y a pas de ressources. Donc, c'est vraiment très épuisant. Les voitures sont très chargées. On empile vraiment des personnes les uns sur les autres et à peine si les personnes peuvent bouger. Les personnes sont prises des fois en otage. torturés et on leur demande d'appeler leur famille pour qu'ils puissent demander encore plus d'argent sous peine de mort. Bon, s'ils ne donnent pas de l'argent que les passeurs réclament, on les tue. Donc, les passeurs aussi, des fois, sont des tortionnaires de leurs clients. Alors, les personnes ont témoigné aussi qu'ils ont été soumis aux travaux forcés par leurs passeurs. Ils ont été dépouillés de passeports, de cartes de papier qui peuvent identifier, qui peuvent leur permettre une identification. Et aussi, ils soumettent leurs clients des fois aussi au voyage, qui savent très bien que ces personnes vont être noyées. Alors, on a eu quelques témoignages très poignants de certaines personnes et on a voulu les noter. Alors, il y a une personne qui nous dit « J'ai payé des frais de voyage jusqu'en Tunisie et la moitié de ma traversée par la mer avant de quitter mon pays. Mais à mon arrivée, mon passeur m'a informé que dans ces services sont offerts le logement, la nourriture pendant un moment sur le territoire avant de continuer le reste de mon voyage. Sauf que c'était pas vrai et j'ai été détenue contre mon gré. La famille dans laquelle je me suis retrouvée, j'ai eu à travailler de force, sans salaire et cela pendant 9 mois jusqu'à ce que je décide de m'enfuir. On a aussi le témoignage d'une autre personne qui nous dit « J'ai été mis dans une pièce par mon passeur au niveau de Sfax où il nous a dit « Les bateaux seront lancés dans 2 jours ». Sauf qu'ils étaient associés avec les policiers et le jour d'après, les policiers sont venus nous prendre tout notre argent, y compris la somme qu'on avait déjà payée avant et ils nous ont chassés. Quelques jours après, on a retrouvé ces passeurs-là. On les a mis la pression pour qu'ils nous remettent notre argent et nous ont dit les policiers sont de notre côté, on travaille avec eux, donc vous ne pouvez rien nous faire vu qu'on est protégé, on est très bien protégé dans notre réseau. Et on a aussi un autre témoignage d'une personne d'une autre personne, oui, qui me dit « Je me rappelle lors de ma tentative de traversée par bateau, nous étions au rivage, on attendait la lancée de notre bateau, mais le bateau qui était parti avant nous avait été intercepté par un bateau de la marine. Le bateau venait vers eux et ensuite a dû faire demi-tour. Mais nous, au rivage, on entendait le passeur parler et il disait très clairement, il négociait très clairement avec leur indique de la marine en les suppliant de laisser le bateau partir, de ne pas les renvoyer. Mais le résultat de ça, c'est que nous, on n'a pas pu lancer notre bateau, donc on n'a pas pu voyager ce soir-là. C'était, voilà, il a dû négocier pour le passage. Donc, on peut relever comme ça plein d'indices qui montrent que les passeurs vraiment ils sont beaucoup plus grands que ça. Ce n'est pas que des personnes qu'on peut retrouver en route. Il y a beaucoup plus de personnes que ça. Le réseau est beaucoup plus étendu. Et même, il y a les réseaux, des fois, vont jusqu'à la chaîne internationale, c'est-à-dire depuis les pays, par exemple, subsahariens. On va voir des passeurs qui travaillent seulement dans la zone, mais après, ensuite, qui vont lancer le relais à d'autres qui travaillent peut-être en Afrique du Nord. Et ensuite, il y a d'autres qui sont de l'autre côté pour réceptionner les colis, qui sont des personnes, bien sûr, et les faire intégrer certains réseaux aussi. Donc, c'est beaucoup plus grand que ça. Je pense que c'est tout. Et voilà, merci.
Merci beaucoup, José, pour ce témoignage et cette présentation. Comme on a 2 minutes, je voulais juste revenir sur des points et peut-être vous faire de petites questions, si vous me permettez. J'étais curieuse de savoir la perception vraiment des migrants et des passeurs sur la migration irrégulière, non? Cette terminologie qu'on utilise, non, qui n'existait pas vraiment en Afrique, c'est une création de 2 pays de destination. Et la migration était quand même, non, un fait de vie, un fait humain, à travers des frontières qui n'existaient même pas, non? Est-ce que vous pensez que cette croissante criminalisation de la migration irrégulière sans papier, qui a augmenté la conscience un peu chez les migrants et chez les passeurs aussi de la migration irrégulière, ou c'est bien, parce qu'on a aussi on a fait d'entretiens avec des migrants comme partie de notre recherche, et c'est vraiment parfois difficile d'expliquer la migration irrégulière, non, les visas et tout, c'est pas vraiment clair cette distinction parfois. Donc, je me demandais ça. Et j'étais aussi, je voulais revenir sur un point que vous avez mentionné sur le fait que les passeurs cherchent ou recrutent, non, leurs clients. Vous avez dit les négociateurs sont là pour chercher leurs clients. Alors, on parle non, du processus de la prise de décision par les migrants, de la décision d'émigrer. Quel rôle pensez-vous que les passeurs ont dans l'initiation d'un processus de migration? Toutes choses égales, bien sûr, mais est-ce que ça a des implications aussi de politique importantes? Je voulais juste voilà, revenir sur ça, si vous pouvez répondre voilà, en 2 minutes, après on passe à la prochaine présentation. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Je ne sais pas si j'ai bien compris la première question, mais je vais essayer de répondre à la deuxième. Alors, pour la deuxième question, je pense que la responsabilité des migrants est très importante parce que c'est elle qui accepte de partir. Mais le passeur, c'est lui qui génère l'idée dans la tête de la personne en question. Donc, lui, il vient avec un mensonge, enfin, quelque chose qui est complètement fake, et il fait comprendre à cette personne-là que voilà, tu vas partir, moi je vais faciliter les choses parce que moi je suis déjà là-bas, je vais te faire partir, et quand tu vas partir, par exemple, tu vas toucher un salaire qui sera beaucoup plus mieux que ce que tu touches maintenant, tu vas pouvoir travailler facilement, tu auras par exemple la possibilité de profiter de certains avantages, et en plus de ça, si à l'étranger, c'est plus développé, donc la personne ne voit que des avantages, mais la personne ne sait pas que par exemple, quand elle va arriver dans un pays comme la Tunisie, il y a comment on appelle ça, il y a une carte de séjour qu'il faut faire pour être en règle, et pour faire une carte de séjour, ça veut dire que tu as réellement une activité sur le territoire. Tous ces petits détails, la personne n'est pas au courant. La personne n'a même aucune idée de combien coûte un loyer en Tunisie. En fait, donc quand la personne arrive, elle se rend compte qu'en fait, tout ce qu'on lui a raconté comme histoire, ce n'est que des illusions, et elle se trouve vraiment, vraiment bernée. Et comme un pays comme la Tunisie, il faut obligatoirement une carte de séjour, il faut obligatoirement être en règle, et même pour assurer ta sortie, la personne se trouve piégée, et la personne commence à comprendre ça des fois après 6 mois, après 1 an, le temps est déjà passé, donc c'est complètement impossible pour elle de faire marche arrière, et elle se dit, pendant qu'on y est, autant mieux continuer dans l'illégalité, et elle est prête à aller affronter la mer en fait, et même pour se noyer, puisqu'elle ne peut pas faire marche arrière, elle ne peut pas rattraper ce qui s'est passé en fait. Voilà. La première, désolée, je n'ai pas bien compris. Donc...
On va y revenir. Merci beaucoup,
Je
José.
vous en prie.
Alors, I'll switch back to English, and we move forward with the next and last presentation for this session will be a joint presentation again. So I will hand over, to Dr. Odessa Gonzalez-Benson and colleagues also at the Association pour tous. So over to you, Odessa. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay. I have my screen. Okay, thank you. I can't see everybody. So thank you, everybody. My name is Odessa. I'm from the University of Michigan in the US, but I'm actually in California. It's 6 a.m. here. Good morning. And I'm here joined by Ahmed Sultani, who is president of Association La Terre pour Tout in Tunisia, and also his colleague Marwan Saidi, and also Badr Al-Bader, also of the University of Michigan. And I will start us out with this presentation, but they will be speaking about the second half of the presentation. I also wanted to just thank the Migration Center and the organizers for this opportunity. And so this is our participatory action research project, which drew from the narratives of families of missing migrants in Tunisia, and then These narratives were created into a set of posters and data visualizations by students at the University of Michigan. So an action research project is one that, let me check the time, sorry, is one that is research not just for production of knowledge, but also for action or having direct impacts or outcomes for research participants. And so what we did here is we featured the posters done by the students into an exhibit at the University of Michigan, month-long exhibit in February 2020. There were dozens of faculty members, students, and other university community members who came together during the opening to come and witness with us what's happening in the Mediterranean. And Ahmed and his team in Tunisia joined us with a live feed for like a live dialogue with the audience to engage in these conversations across the transnational spaces. And then this collection of work will be made available on a dedicated online platform called missingmigrants.org, which came live today in time for this presentation. So if you have a moment to check those, the full posters are there. So in terms of the process, so it started with 7 families of missing migrants who work with Ahmed in La Terre, Porto, provide us with personal stories and photos, and then the students then turn these into visual works. They also use data from existing sources like IOM. And this is our process of turning visual or verbal.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We just cannot see the slides. So if you're trying to share your screen, it's not working. So you might just to check. There are also comments in the chat.
Oh, Can Badr, can you share it? You should see the slides because that's where the
yes, just give me a second. Let me pull it up.
I was talking and talking. Sorry about that.
Great, it's working now, yes. Sorry to interrupt. Thank you.
Well, those are not the slides. Oh, I see. You know what? I'm not sharing my screen. Wait, I should have. Let me try again. Okay, sorry about this. Are you seeing now?
Problem at all. We're seeing it now, yes.
Okay. I did not click share screen. So this is our opening slide, and this is a discussion about introduce our project. And there's Ahmed's work and a team of his the photos up there. And this is us talking about how we use the personal narratives to turn them into visual posters. And so for the process of turning verbal to visual, the student designers recognize technological, sociocultural, and cognitive factors that inform design decisions and employed a variety of techniques. So we go into this detail in another paper, so we won't go into these technical details about this translation, but the students did focus on conveying the profoundness of the messages and eliciting emotional response, and specifically to turn statistics and data into something meaningful for our audience and participants, right? Because we have the statistics and it can be overwhelming hearing about numbers and hundreds of people. And so we sought to give visuals. And so this is one of the posters. So you'll see the posters on the right, your left, my right side. And here's an example. Some of the graduate students also did maps. And this is meant to have the names or numbers of people in real time. And here's another example. And you can see these in the website. And again, here are some more examples. And in the interest of time, I will not read these. They are also in our presentation note that's available to participants. But here are some examples of narratives of the students who created them and how they went through that process of converting it, right? So here is about the father, and as this stark message of coming face to face with him. And here's another one. It uses a wider symbolic context of open palms to convey meaning. And here's another one using traditional Tunisian motifs. And then what kind of emerged from the family's narratives is not just one of loss, but also hope and action. And I should say, though, that smuggling was not specifically an area of inquiry for us, but it did emerge in some of the narratives. Checking the time. And I will talk about some of the mother's quotes. This is Emna. So he began plotting to leave after the revolution. My son said there was nothing left for him in this country. He told me 3 or 4 days before leaving, he asked me for money. He borrowed money from many people and his siblings. So I think that this quote here illustrates temporality. So we have this plotting, since the revolution, so it's been years, but at the same time, it's very short because it's 3 or 4 days before leaving, right? And we get a sense of these temporal dynamics components from families' narratives. And also it shows the community. So he borrowed money from his family 3 or 4 days before to go to, so it's that sense of urgency and timeliness. And here the government is neglecting our youth. They're trying to deter them by showing them cases of dead migrants, but how will that stop them when they already feel dead living in this country? And similarly, here's another quote: democracy and freedom are just ideologies, but when you go to touch it, you'll find nothing. So in these two quotes, we wanted to highlight how the structural analysis that the mothers have, right? These are deeply personal, but they are very structural in their and contextual, right? They're alluding to democracy and the government's efforts. And, I was listening to Sarah and Megan's presentation earlier about the critical analysis. And so I think that it parallels these mothers' ideas and insights, right? And here's when I pleaded into the phone. He never said his name, but he said he was calling from Italy. He begged for my forgiveness. And this is the last time that this mother talked to her son, and she didn't know what was happening. She said that he said there were people watching him, so he couldn't speak. And so I think this also relates to what Vincent spoke about earlier about myths and the information, the lack of information that then comes from these migrations. And then we have these: our cases should have been closed. It has been 9 years. This is from Haseen and Malika. And 3 more slides on smuggling specifically before I turn it over to my colleagues. So for families, relationships with smugglers are personal, but also transactional. So it's personal because they view them as heroic and very close if the migrant makes it, but it's transactional also because it's a business deal. And if they get missing, then it becomes a need for accountability. And for the public, smuggling is criminal and must be controlled. So we see some different relations with smugglers. But smuggling is also much larger than the sum of individual smugglers and migrants. So I think much like what Josie said earlier, how it's bigger, but also in this case, migrants are larger in the sense of the broader structural context that links them, that my colleagues will then talk about in terms of potential policy directions to consider.
Thank you, Odessa. this is Badr speaking. Hope you can see me. Just to start off, policy directions to consider as a collective here today. We really want to start with this idea of centering the families. We speak quite a bit about migrants, and it's very important to do so, whether dead or alive. But when this beloved person leaves, he does leave behind a whole set of relations, kin, and friends. And so the first recommendation we have, what does it mean to engage these families and the grassroots groups that are built around them, is perhaps to simply work with them, especially kind of in a participatory action research framework, but to work with them like we've tried to do on representational practices. And I'm using that word in both the graphic communicative sense and also the political sense. Another thing that came up in our engagement with these families is that smuggling is almost a black box to them. They may notice the smuggler. As we said, it's kind of personal. They may even be a relation, someone related to them, maybe even a friend of their son. And we've dealt mostly with sons who've migrated. But once migration takes place, once the smuggling process is begun, it becomes a black box, and then the son is kind of lost at sea or in kind of these border regimes. And so it's a surreptitious form of movement when it comes to the families, knowing the whereabouts of their loved ones. And so reducing movement in the dark as much as we can is quite important. So what does this mean? I mean, to put this in an imperative form, for authorities and large organizations that don't move people that don't really need to be moved. I mean, even detention, deportation, or these kind of hegemonic systems, because once migrants are moved around, it's really hard to keep track of them, especially in connection with their families and agencies and whatnot. So it's tied to kind of being better at tracking. Another sense or another side to this issue on the Tunisian side is criminal justice reform, like who is criminalized in this process. And we've heard that post-carceral employment is something that needs to be thought of much more closely. To tie it to kind of the southern shore of Europe, is like, if you don't want the Tunisians on your shore, invest in Tunisian jobs at home, since if you're spending money on deporting people, you can spend money on preventing them from being in a deportable state, so to speak. And just one last recommendation in relationship to DNA is Tunisians have really started working on this in earnest, and so to expand them, to expand these projects, they're often undertaking is on the part of researchers at universities rather than governmental agencies. And so to just enter into these kind of experience and expertise sharing agreements to coordinate between the northern and southern shores of Europe and sustaining exchange of forensic knowledge, whether it's genetic material or analyses themselves. And I'm thinking here specifically in relationship with Italy and Malta. We go to the next slide. Thanks. And just to kind of add something much more aspirational here, kind of a long-term objective, and we do realize it is aspirational, but to consider a regional framework for freedom of movement. So, over a decade ago, for example, Sarkozy really tried to push this Mediterranean Union. And so we'd rather think beyond a neo-colonial framework, but to think about this region as a visa-free place. Because visa-free is important here, because I think it's just wise to think beyond this model that was developed out of World War I. And just to make it less pie in the sky, I think we can look at the very recent Northern Ireland Protocol as a real-life precedent. But I must say here, whether it's the Maghreb Union, Mediterranean Union, the Northern Ireland Protocol, they're all really struggling. So it's not going to be easy, but it's a worthwhile long-term goal to keep in view.
Yeah. I also wanted to add there to connect it to what Mr. Cochetel said at his presentation earlier about small cooperative projects. That was a point of discussion earlier, and so I think that this relates to the same aspirations. and Mr. Sultani. Madam Marwan.
عماد I think لازم تعمل unmute. Can the host please unmute Ahmed?
It's the
عماد معاكم؟
Oui.
عماد السلطاني رئيس جمعية الأرض للجميع، انبعث من 2011 وبعثنا هالجمعية ذي لأجل الشباب المفقودين في التراب الإيطالي، إن من ضمنهم زوز ولاد خويا مع العائلات، واشتغلنا مع عديد منظمات دولية في إيطاليا، في فرنسا، في إسبانيا، والمشروع مع أوديسا والتلامذة بتاعهم. ولكن جمعية الأرض للجميع بعد عمل طويل قلنا لازم حلول، وأين المشكل وكيفاش نجموا نحيوا المشاكل هذه. الأصل من أكبر المشاكل اللي لقيناها في أسباب الهجرة اللانظامية هي هذه التأشيرة المستحيلة. التأشيرة هذه في تونس الحق يقال أصبحت وكأنها سرقة ونهب للمال العام التونسي، لأنه معظم التونسيين اللي يقدموا التأشيرة باش يمشيوا بطريقة نظامية عبر المطارات عبر الحدود بطريقة قانونية يلقوا الرفض، والرفض ما فيش ولا مبرر، يعني ما يعطوش مبرر. هذا ما يجعل الشباب يبحثوا عن طريقة أخرى. الطريقة الأخرى الوحيدة هي الهجرة اللانظامية. في بحثهم عن الهجرة اللانظامية هو في بحث حياة أخرى، في كرامة أخرى، يتلقاو بالمجرمين، هذوما يتلقاو بالمهربين اللي نحن ما نجموش نسموهم هما ناس عاديين، هما مجرمين ما فيهمش سؤال آخر. ولكن كل السياسات من التسعينات كانوا يحطوا المسؤولية كاملة للمهربين، ونحن جمعية الأرض للجميع الراو اللي المسؤولية هي ضئيلة للمهاجرين، واجب يتعاقبوا. لكن أكبر معناه سبب هو التأشيرة المستحيلة. ليش نقول الكلام هذا؟ لأنه لما تمشي تدفع باش تاخذ تأشيرة، التأشيرة شكون يمشي طالبها؟ الفئة من المهاجرين هذوما اللانظاميين هما عاطلي على العمل، ما عندهمش معناها كونت بانكير، ما عندهمش الوثائق المستحيلة تطلبها كل السفارات الأوروبية، ولهذا معناها مستحيل هما باش ياخذوا التأشيرة هذه، ومستحيل باش يكون عندهم فرصة ياخذوا التأشيرة. ولهذا نحن نقولوا سياسة التأشيرة اللي هي المستحيلة هي أكبر سبب باش تدز العباد تمشي وتهاجر بطريقة لا نظامية، وهي خلقة المهربين. إذا ما نخزوش بالمنظار هذا راهو ما نجموش نوقفوا كل المأساة اللي البحر الأبيض المتوسط أصبح مقبرة كاملة للمهاجرين، أصبح معناها مأساة لعائلاتهم، أصبح مأساة الأصدقاء. كل مهاجر لا نظامي يصبح مفقود أو ميت وراه قصة كاملة. ولهذا نحن نراو كجمعية الأرض للجميع هو البحث عن الحلول. حتى الحلول الذي هنالك تأشيرة يقول لك للعمل إلى إيطاليا، نحن كمجتمع مدني عمرنا ما سمعنا بها، وإذا وجدت هذه التأشيرة للعمل هي مستحيلة، ما نراوهاش، وربما تباع من طرف الدولة التونسية. نحن نراو وكجمعية الأرض للجميع طلبنا للاتحاد الأوروبي وكل الدول التي تحترم المواثيق الدولية لحقوق الإنسان هي احترام ما وقعوا عليه. ما وقعوا عليه يقول لك كل البشر له الحق في التنقل بطريقة قانونية، لأنه كل دولة في العالم من حقها باش تحرس بلادها وتعرف شكون يدخل لبلادها. ولهذا نحن نراو هي إلغاء هذه التأشيرة، ويكون المطارات والأمن أي دولة باش تستقبلك وأي دولة باش تخرج منها معناها كتونس، هو المطار والأمن يعملوا معناها مراقبة على جواز السفر بتاعك، مراقبة عليك أنت من. إذا أنت ما عندك حتى تتبعات من حقك تمشي لأي دولة في العالم، تمشي أقل شيء يسيبوا معناها زيارة سياحية. زيارة سياحية إن وجد حظه فمرحبا به ويشتغل، إن لم يوجد يرجع لتونس معزز مكرم، وهكا نقطعوا مع الموتى والمفقودين في البحر المتوسط ومع المهربين هذا المجرمين. معناها ما عادش نعطيوهم السوق هذا اسمه سوق تكون جرة سياسات الاتحاد الأوروبي في غلق الحدود وفرض التأشيرة المستحيلة اللي فيها عديد من التجاوزات. من ضمن التجاوزات في هذه التأشيرة هي يطلبوا أشياء غير معقولة. هو يطلبوا البصمات هذه معطيات شخصية في تونس، عندنا هيئة تحترم بالمعطيات الشخصية، ممنوع تاخذها. يطلبوا هي البنك بتاعك ايش عندك فلوس، وهذه معطيات شخصية ممنوعة، مع أن هذه كل الدول الأوروبية تقول نحن دول تابعة للاتحاد الأوروبي، نحترم حقوق الإنسان، نحترم مواثيق دولية، ولكن في كل المطالب للتأشيرة ما فيش احترام لكل هذه المواثيق. ولهذا نحن نطالب الاتحاد الأوروبي يتراجع سياساتها للهجرة. من التسعينات موجود عديد منظمات في تونس وكل أفريقيا ما نجموش يوقفوا هالطيار وهالمأساة. الحل الوحيد هي بحث سياسات أخرى، سياسات تقطع مع الموتى والمفقودين. هو في الأصل هذا ملف ليس تجاري وليس سياسي، هو ملف إنساني. إن لنا الجرأة والإنسانية كما نقول في العالم، الحل الوحيد اللي هي عملته جمعية الأرض للجميع، واسم على مسمى جمعيتنا الأرض للجميع. نتمنى الأرض أن تكون للجميع للعموم، ولكن بطريقة قانونية مقننة، يدخل على القنوات الرسمية، ويكون هذا أحسن طريقة معناها للعمل الإنساني ونقطع مع كل المأساة. هذا هو نحن اللي نشتغل عليه، وهذا هو باش نواصل ونشتغلوا عليه، ونتمنى الاتحاد الأوروبي يحترم هدايا، ويحترم أكثر شيء هي المواثيق الدولية لحقوق الإنسان.
Yeah. So I will just need to add just one last point before we finish with our presentation. So just Ahmed didn't mention that after the revolution, Tunisians start to. No, I'm just. After the revolution, Tunisians started to raise awareness or to have knowledge about their rights and their freedom that they need to acquire like any other citizens, especially in the other democracies just in front of Tunisia, in the European Union or other countries. And one of the main rights, let's say, is the right of movement. So the proof of this that just after the revolution we had like a large number of people gone missing in the Mediterranean because people thousands of people tried to get a visa to get their right or to enjoy their rights to move in Europe or any other countries, but since all the requests failed with no clear reason, they used they went over the sea, they crossed over the Mediterranean, which led to this loss. So I would like to finish with our one of our main policy recommendation is to revise the visa requirement, at least by being more transparent, by giving exact paper that if you provide you would get a visa, and not like that asking a lot of papers, and in the end you will not even know why you were refused, because even if you provide sometimes the refusal can not be justified because you provided all the documents. So I would sum up and tell that at least for now, like the instant solution is to by easing the visa restriction and like asking for a clear and well documented papers. And in the end, I would think that Tunisian has the right, like any other, like the majority of nationalities, to move in the nearby, like at least even in the nearby countries, by meaning the European Union, freely.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's it.
And we just wanted to end that we join our other colleagues in calling for these broader changes. And here's our information. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much to all of you for this powerful presentation. Thanks for also, I touched upon many different aspects, and first of all, thank you for bringing attention to the issue of the families of missing migrants, which does not receive by far, I mean, at least the amount of attention that it deserves. And you may know that also IOM and the Global Center where I work, GMDAC, is also working on this same issue and trying to amplify the voices of families of missing migrants and understand also all the legal and policy and emotional implications of what the loss of a family member or a relative might mean for these families, and how to help address all of these issues in practice. There's also obviously the linkage with the main focus of this panel, which is smuggling, right? And the fact that, again, I think we're unpacking all of the various complexities of smuggling and smugglers, the transactional nature, but also really the fact that smugglers can and often are part of these local communities and the inner social circle, and that can also have a role often in the tracing and identification of missing migrants. And this is something that is also emerging from our research. And so we often talk about, we have talked also this morning about the blurred lines between trafficking and smuggling, which obviously do exist. But this distinction is sometimes actually critical to also ensure that smugglers are not excessively criminalized or penalized and can, for instance, participate in processes of tracing and identification of missing family members, which is obviously a very delicate issue. And then also, obviously, the policy implications and of all of these, and what does it mean to counter smuggling effectively, to counter irregular migration, to address issues of deaths, unnecessary deaths in the Mediterranean, and also other migratory routes around the world. Obviously, one of the clear ways to do this, expanding safe and legal pathways for migration from these countries to countries of destination, and incentivizing more circular migration and easier access to information also about all of these different legal pathways. So there was also a comment about this actually in the chat, sort of a call to reality from Vincent Costel about let's not dream. As you may have seen, as long as North African states do also not reaccept their nationals, those not eligible for a stay in Europe, there will be no progress towards visa liberalization, or at least circular migration and more legal pathways also for migration from North Africa to Europe as well. So I would perhaps start opening the floor for questions and comments. I don't want to talk too much, and then I will highlight maybe a few points that I think have emerged already from all of these various very interesting presentations and discussion. So feel free to raise your hands, all attendees, or post your questions in the Q&A and chat box. I see already a hand raised. Monsieur Sambou Baki, please, vous avez la parole.
Oui, bonjour. Donc, je vais parler en français. Est-ce que tout le monde m'entend?
Oui, on vous entend.
Voilà.
Yes.
Oui, je vous entends, mais je voudrais comment faire pour ne pas avoir Oui. Alors, donc, très rapidement, en fait, je suis en train, j'essaie de ne pas, parce que je suis en train de me faire répéter par ma voix. Comment je peux enlever la voix?
On vous entend très bien, Monsieur Bouhari, si vous voulez.
Désactiver, peut-être je vais faire. Oui, voilà. Donc, est-ce que ça marche maintenant? Voilà. Donc, merci. Très rapidement, donc, en quelque sorte, moi, je suis Hassan Boubakri, je travaille sur l'immigration, je suis professeur à l'université de Sousse en Tunisie. Et je voudrais réagir en quelque sorte un peu aussi bien aux propos de Vincent Cochetel ce matin, l'expliquer ce matin. En gros, je veux dire, c'est un regard très transversal sur toutes les questions qui ont été soulevées. Et moi, il me semble que toutes ces questions de traite, de trafic de migrants, font désormais partie en quelque sorte des maux de nos sociétés, des maux globaux de nos sociétés, c'est-à-dire rejoindre quelque chose, je veux dire, toutes les difficultés qu'ont nos sociétés modernes un peu à s'épanouir. Et je crois que l'impact des migrations irrégulières et derrière elles, les facteurs profonds qui aboutissent ou qui donnent lieu à ces migrations irrégulières et donnent lieu après à toutes ces formes d'escroquerie, de trafic, de traite, sont en quelque sorte, il faudrait les traiter d'une manière globale, transversale. Et il me semble que, je veux dire, tous les acteurs sont impliqués et doivent revoir leur copie en quelque sorte dans les relations entre les pays riches et les pays pauvres, en Méditerranée, entre l'Union européenne et l'Afrique du Nord, ou entre même les États d'Afrique du Nord et les États d'Afrique subsaharienne. On voit par exemple qu'au niveau de l'Afrique subsaharienne et les relations entre l'Afrique du Nord et l'Afrique subsaharienne, les États d'Afrique du Nord appliquent les mêmes politiques migratoires dures vis-à-vis des ressortissants des autres pays tiers que les politiques qui sont appliquées par l'Union européenne vis-à-vis des ressortissants des pays d'Afrique du Nord. Donc tout le monde, en quelque sorte, est piégé dans ce mot global, dans ce mal global que nous vivons. Et il me semble même à un niveau encore plus bas, au niveau des États internes, je veux dire, les États laissent se développer des formes de traite, de trafficking, de traite et de trafic de migrants, et toutes les formes d'escroquerie, de crimes qui accompagnent ces trafics de migrants. Et elles ne font rien. On le voit bien, Vincent Cochetel ce matin l'a remarqué, elles ne font rien. Je veux dire, les États d'origine ne font rien. La Tunisie est aussi bien un pays de transit qu'un pays d'origine, et je dirais presque ne fait rien, parce que même par rapport à la migration irrégulière de ses propres fils, on voit que le mal profond, le facteur profond, c'est la fracture régionale, c'est les inégalités entre les régions, c'est les inégalités sociales. Donc c'est normal qu'on tombe, en fait, tout le monde tombe dans ce piège global qui est un peu la marginalisation des couches. Et moi, je dirais, je termine par ça, j'irai même plus loin. Ces mères dont a parlé Rimed, dont a parlé Odessa tout à l'heure, elles ont participé en partie à ces trafics, puisqu'elles ont donné l'argent à leurs enfants, elles ont aidé leurs enfants. Je ne dirais pas qu'elles ont choisi cette solution, mais je dis que toutes les couches de la société, les victimes comme les criminels, sont en quelque sorte tous victimes d'un mal global qui est cette mauvaise gouvernance d'immigration, cette mauvaise gouvernance de la richesse, ces inégalités entre le nord et le sud, ce manque de solidarité entre les pays riches et les pays pauvres. Donc, je dirais, on va chercher les petits criminels, les petites responsabilités vis-à-vis des mères qui donnent l'argent à leurs enfants, qui aident leurs enfants pour partir, pour être pris. Elles payent les smugglers, elles payent les trafiquants, et en même temps, on n'arrive pas un peu à pointer un mal global qui est la mauvaise gouvernance de la migration. Excusez-moi d'avoir été un peu long, mais il me semble qu'il fallait avoir un peu ce cadrage, ce framework, ce global, ce wide framework. Merci.
Merci beaucoup à vous, Monsieur Bourki. Are there any reactions from the panelists to Mr. Boubakri's comments just now? Ahmed, are you raising your hand, or did I see?
Before Ahmed starts, can I just make a point of clarification that one mother provided the money, but the other mothers it's a complex situation. It's all not uniform, right? So other mothers pleaded for their sons not to leave, and each story is individual. Ahmed?
Thank you for highlighting these differences as well. That's the important individual experience.
نحب نقول أنا هذا الخطاب اللي سمعناه من سيادتك ونحترموه لأقصى درجة. هذا الخطاب من التسعينيات، ولكن الحلول غير موجودة. الخطاب عمره في خطاب الاتحاد الأوروبي والحكومة التونسية دائما يحملوا المسؤولية إلى أضعف حلقة. هما حلقات الهجرة اللانظامية، والحلقة الكبيرة هي تونس التي وفرت المناخ، التي لم تعطي فرصة للعمل، التي لم تحترم كرامة المواطن، التي هي من دفعت المواطن أن يخمم في الهجرة اللانظامية. 1. 2. الاتحاد الأوروبي الذي لا تريدون تحميله المسؤولية. هو أي إنسان تخلقنا في الدنيا أن يكون حر، أن يختار أين يذهب. لما يذهب باش يحب يشوف فرصة أخرى في أوروبا، نرقى الدول التي تقول نحن نحترم المواثيق الدولية وحقوق الإنسان في حرية التنقل، لا يتحملون المسؤولية. ليش هذا المواطن ليس له الحق مثل المواطن الأوروبي؟ ليش فيها التفرقة؟ ليش الاتحاد الأوروبي أي مواطن من الاتحاد الأوروبي له الحق في التنقل في كل العالم؟ هل خلقنا أن يكون بيننا ميز بين الأوروبي والإفريقي؟ لا سيدي، ربي خلقنا سواسية، مثل نحن كنا بشر ونشتغل على مسألة إنسانية. بهذا الخطاب الذي سمعناه الآن تحميل المسؤولية إلى الحلقة الأضعف هي العائلات والمهربين، هذا إجرام آخر. واجب أن نحمل الكل مسؤولية. أكبر مسؤولية هو من دفع الشباب أن يخمم في الهجرة اللانظامية، ومن منع الشباب أن يبحث في غدا أفضل. هذم لازم نحملهم. ولكن هيهات، هل أقوياء الحكومات التونسية لأن هي الدولة لا تريد تحمل مسؤولية، تقول نحن ما رعيناش بشبابنا. وهذا الاتحاد الأوروبي اللي هو من منطق القوة يريد دائم لا يتحمل المسؤولية. سيدي، العائلة تتحمل مسؤولية، المهاجر يتحمل مسؤولية، المهرب يتحمل، ولكن هذا من الحلق الضعاف. ولكن الاتحاد الأوروبي ولا يوم قالوا نحن من نتحمل مسؤولية، لأن خلقنا هذه السياسة الفاشلة من عام 90. لوام موجودة، الهسيار موجودة، يساعدوا في المهاجرين، يعاونوا في المهاجرين، يحكيوا، ولكن الهجرة متواصلة إلى غدا وبعد غدا، لأنه المواطن نحن حكينا معاه وقلنا هذا موت. نقول لك
excuse me for interrupting, but I think if you could wrap up, please, your thoughts, because we will need to move on to the next questions and have time for a wider discussion also about the other presentations. Sorry for interrupting. Thank you very much. There is a question from one of our participants, Georgia Cole, to all the panelists as well. If you might have seen it in the chat, if you could comment on how, alongside opportunities to move to Europe, employment and mobility options in the wider MENA region impact migration decision-making among the populations that you work with. So how is unemployment prospects or employment prospects in the region impacting on decision-making based on your research? Who would like to answer that question from the group?
I think that I didn't quite understand what the. I think that I didn't understand the really question. What is about exactly? But if it is it about the path that North African are taking, like to go to Europe, not for the MENA region? Can you please clarify, Georgia?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think I was just curious because a lot of the discussion was focused around opportunities within Europe. Oh, sorry, Hassan. I don't know. Yeah, a lot of the discussion was focused around opportunities within Europe and how that was impacting upon decision-making within these populations. I wondered how opportunities and job prospects within North Africa and the Middle East were also related to these decisions being made about travel to Europe.
Yes, I think now that you know that Tunisia had the revolution 10 years ago, that impacted the economy of Tunisia, and let's say in a bit of a bad way, because with the with the protest all over the country, that stopped almost any possibility of employment, let's say for the public and especially for the people or for the youth that does not have a high diploma from university and everything. So in the end they were stuck, let's say, if I can say the word, stuck with the possibility of only immigrating, because there is even some laws in Tunisia about if you were in prison for let's say, I think it's 3 months, you are no longer you are no longer able to work in anything related to the public. So this pushed some Tunisian who had this this small period of prison to maybe to be stuck and to go to migrate to Europe, let's say. I don't know if I answered your question.
Thank you very much, Marwan. Perhaps
you're welcome.
On the spot, but perhaps Jose, you might want to also provide some perspective here, given your experience on the ground as for a MI monitor, on how employment prospects in the MENA region affect sort of decision-making of migrants. Sorry to put you on the spot here. Any other thoughts, Jose, or we'll move on to the next questions, perhaps?
Sorry, there's a technical difficulty, but we're just bringing a microphone to Jose now. One moment.
Thank you, Ayla.
Okay.
Désolée, un petit problème d'ordinateur. Ok, j'entends la traduction. Mine is set to translation. Sorry. Ok. Alors, si j'ai bien compris la question, je ne sais pas si je me trompe, vous me dites, c'est la responsabilité sur la prise des décisions des migrants pour se lancer sur le chemin de migration, c'est ça? C'est ça la question? Alors, pour ma part, je pense que les migrants, quand ils sont dans leur pays, ils sont à la recherche d'opportunités. Et comme il n'y a pas d'opportunités dans leur pays, il n'y a pas, actuellement, ça va vraiment de mal en pire plutôt. Les politiques ne sont pas vraiment ce que la population attend. Les personnes n'ont pas la possibilité de vraiment s'investir à faire quelque chose, à nourrir leur famille. Franchement, ça devient de plus en plus difficile pour tout le monde. Et ils sont à la recherche de quelque chose de mieux, une expérience qui peut être meilleure pour eux, pour qu'ils puissent manger, prendre soin d'eux et prendre soin de leur famille. Donc, du coup, quand on vient leur proposer quelque chose de mieux, quelque chose qui paraît être une possibilité de solution, ils se lancent quelque part, je veux dire, sans trop réfléchir, mais il faut aussi dire que le patient ne cherche pas des personnes qui sont capables de réfléchir. Les patients ne s'investissent pas beaucoup sur des personnes qui ont fait l'école, qui ont vraiment des informations sur les autres pays. Les patients sont beaucoup plus à la recherche des personnes qui peuvent être physiquement rentables, physiquement qui, c'est possible pour eux facilement de travailler, je veux dire, faire des travaux ménagers, enfin, avoir la possibilité de vraiment travailler. Ils sont beaucoup plus concentrés là-dessus. Et est-ce que les familles sont prêtes à payer ou pas? Donc, c'est ce qui les intéresse et pour eux, ce sont des clients formidables. Donc, ils ne vont pas aller chercher quelqu'un qui va réfléchir, va se poser des questions. Est-ce que c'est vraiment le meilleur chemin à prendre ou pas? Donc, c'est un peu ça, quoi. Il y a vraiment le dilemme de la situation du pays qui ne permet pas vraiment beaucoup trop de choses. Il n'y a pas d'opportunité, il n'y a pas de travail. Les gens vraiment cherchent du travail pour pouvoir se nourrir. Et il y a aussi le fait qu'à côté, il y a une possibilité de faire quelque chose, mais en même temps, les personnes cibles sont des personnes qui n'ont pas l'information requise par rapport à la réalité de la migration. Voilà. Je ne sais pas si j'ai répondu.
Merci beaucoup, José. Oui, très bien, merci. Merci beaucoup. There's another question for both you and Ana Maria, actually going back to your interesting presentations about how the non-Libya smugglers operate. And there's a question from Fergus Peace about, you mentioned that these non-Libyan smugglers had often traveled along the route themselves. So have these smuggling intermediaries given up their journey, or is the smuggling work part of trying to finance further transit for themselves? What are some of your research results there?
Definitely. I think it's twofold. And I think, Fergus, you hit the nail on the head here, that there's people who do both, right? And there are some people who are trying to finance the journey themselves, and there are people who also have settled down in places like Sabha and have more localized connections as well to Libyan intermediaries, who then are more able to provide housing and maybe some more of the structural elements within the smuggling chain. But I think then from what we can see, and Jose can touch on this a bit as well, is that people are also oftentimes incentivized to move or incentivized also to continue their journey. So they're saying, if you can collect 20 people or 30 people, that also reduces your own fees. So in a way, people are both, it can be twofold here. So I can pass it over to Jose now.
D'accord. Désolée, j'ai vraiment un problème avec l'interprétation parce que je n'arrive pas vraiment à comprendre le sens des questions. Est-ce que vous pouvez juste reposer la question pour que je comprenne mieux? Désolée, vraiment.
Fergus, would you like to take the floor to ask the question? I think you're among the panelists.
Sure, I can do that. Do we have the interpretation? No.
I think we do, yeah.
Okay. So the question is just about whether the smugglers who are not Libyan, working in Libya, whether they are trying to finance their own journeys if they're hoping to keep traveling themselves, or if they have stopped traveling themselves and they have settled in Libya to just work now in smuggling. Or whether, I guess it's a mix of those two, but I would be interested in your observations or experience of that. Thank you.
Alors, je pense que les négociateurs, en fait, eux, premièrement, ce sont aussi c'est généralement des personnes qui sont à la recherche de financement pour leur voyage et aussi pour aboutir à leur fin, c'est-à-dire trouver des moyens pour prendre soin de leur famille qu'ils ont laissée dans leur pays d'origine. Donc, oui, ce sont des personnes qui sont vraiment essentiellement là pour trouver du financement déjà pour leur voyage, mais aussi des voies et moyens pour arriver dans le pays de destination. Ou après, ils peuvent ne plus être passeurs, ne plus travailler de cette façon-là, ou bien établir assez de connexions pour pouvoir continuer encore, mais cette fois-ci de façon, étant passeur mieux établi parce qu'il a l'expérience qui va avec et peut-être, oui, l'expérience qui va avec pour pouvoir trouver des clients. Maintenant, c'est les passeurs, en fait, qui ne sont pas libyens, des fois s'établissent aussi dans d'autres pays. Par exemple, ici en Tunisie, il y a des personnes qui sont fabricants de bateaux, par exemple, mais qui sont aussi passeurs, qui sont bien établis dans le pays, qui savent qui contacter pour négocier, pour avoir des personnes. Et ces personnes-là vont chercher où ils peuvent les clients pour le passage. Donc, il y a vraiment, c'est un peu bien reparti. Il y en a qui travaillent vraiment sur l'organisation du voyage et il y en a qui travaillent vraiment sur la connexion avec des clients.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you, Ana Maria. And Jose, there's also a follow-up question about sort of migrants who have formerly used smuggling services becoming smugglers themselves. And Badr is wondering how often sort of this happens. So based on you're a field worker, are there any insights that you could provide there?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think this is something that's so difficult to quantify. Like if we're having trouble even getting numbers on migrant stocks in Tunisia, I mean, we have DTM data in Libya. So this is slightly easier to quantify. I think that this is something definitely that MMC in their 4MI survey, they have a survey that is specifically dedicated to smugglers, and largely the smugglers that we're able to interview are smugglers who are also migrants themselves. So this is something that definitely would be interesting to collect more data on in the future, to have a better sense of how many people who have been smuggled then also become smugglers. So how many of people that they've traveled with have become smugglers. Is this the most viable form of employment in a certain area? What are the other kind of employment opportunities? Why have they chosen this livelihood, etc.?
Thank you very much, Ana Maria.
Je peux rajouter quelque chose.
Oh, José, would you add anything,
Si je
please?
peux juste rajouter quelque chose, c'est par exemple la majorité des Ivoiriens qu'on a eu à interviewer, on s'est rendu compte qu'il y a beaucoup qui ont échoué leur voyage, vraiment beaucoup, qui venaient dans un premier temps juste pour passer, juste pour voyager, et ils ont échoué leur voyage. Au bout de 5 à 6 essais, ils se sont concentrés maintenant eux-mêmes à pouvoir fournir des personnes pour ce voyage-là et peut-être prendre du temps eux-mêmes pour pouvoir voir s'ils vont continuer ou pas. Mais après, c'est devenu réellement un tremplin, quoi. Et on se rend compte aussi que ce sont des personnes que, à force de s'investir dans eux-mêmes leur voyage, acquièrent de l'expérience du voyage et se disent, ah, si je l'ai fait, pourquoi pas faire pareil avec les autres, et voilà, qui cherchent des clients eux aussi.
Merci, José. Unless there are other questions, I wanted to also go back to your presentation, Ana Maria, and it was interesting to note this sort of hierarchical and stratified organization of smuggling operations in Libya and its complexity, right, from the highly organized criminal groups to the individual occasional smugglers, which, as you say, sort of overlap and are not mutually exclusive. And I was wondering how sort of increased efforts towards border control and counter-smuggling have or may have affected these dynamics. Sort of your research, I think, was from 2018, 2019. So I was wondering, since 2016 and before 2016, were these dynamics, significantly different? Is there anything that you could say about whether these dynamics have shifted due to the increased counter-smuggling activities and efforts on this route?
Definitely. I mean, this is one of the main points that really came up with the smugglers who were surveyed and were operating out of Sabha, that really that the increase of Nigerian security forces, particularly at the border, was moving the border south almost. And I know that Vincent today also was touching about how the smugglers and trafficking, that change really happens at border points. And now with the institution of more increased kind of patrolling of these borders and more borders within the country, which are not necessarily a formal border, but also when you're crossing over various controlled territory from different tribes and ethnicities, there has been this kind of increased nature and the need for more control and coordination at these different points. And I think this is also something that has been touched upon in a lot of the other presentations today, that these structural factors which have influenced the individual action. I think this is something that came up this morning as well in Sarah, Elliot, and Megan's presentation, that it's not just the individual, but these structural factors such as changing in border control, which is influencing also the localized smuggling networks and where they're geographically placed.
Thank you very much, Ana Maria. And perhaps also coming back to the other question that I posed you, Jose, sorry again to put you on the spot again, about the perception of irregularity, what it means to be an irregular migrant, an undocumented migrant, among migrants and smugglers themselves, who are again often migrants themselves. But is there sort of, these clear perceptions, and have increased counter-smuggling efforts increase this awareness of the irregularity of the phenomenon of the process?
Alors, la perception des migrants.
On ne t'entend pas, José. Oh,
sorry.
Oh,
Alors, la perception des migrants par rapport à ça. Bon, déjà, j'aimerais préciser que j'étais en Tunisie avant la Révolution et c'est un mouvement qu'on n'avait pas du tout remarqué. Justement parce que il y avait la sécurité, il y avait aussi beaucoup de contrôle. Les étrangers, quand ils entraient en Tunisie, même avec un visa, on leur demandait qu'est-ce que vous venez faire, comment est-ce que vous allez vivre dans le pays. Enfin, il y avait vraiment, point de vue contrôle, il y avait tellement de mesures qui avaient été prises pour que la personne vienne pour un but. Après l'objectif qu'elle a pu atteindre, qu'elle puisse partir pour ne pas rester en situation irrégulière sur le territoire et être poussée à faire des choses qui ne sont pas vraiment réglementaires. Donc, après, il y a eu la révolution et puis il y a comment on appelle ça, cette situation de crise que la Tunisie vit depuis plus de 10 ans aujourd'hui, qui rend en fait le pays tellement ouvert à beaucoup de choses et qui, entre guillemets, encadre ce fléau. Et aujourd'hui, les migrants se sentent arnaqués des deux côtés, pas seulement par les passeurs qui les laissent entrer qui les encouragent à entrer dans le pays en les montant, mais aussi se trouvent arnaqués sur le point de vue de droit et le point de vue de comment on appelle ça, le point de vue juridique en fait, parce qu'on se dit, si on ne veut pas, à plusieurs reprises, il y a eu certains qui m'ont dit, si on ne veut pas de nous, si la Tunisie ne veut pas de nous, autant mieux ne pas nous laisser entrer dans le pays. Pourquoi est-ce qu'on se retrouve en Tunisie? Or, on ne veut pas de nous, en fait. Donc, si on est de la mauvaise graine, OK, on veut rester chez nous, mais ne nous laissez pas entrer. Bon, en même temps, c'est vrai que le passeur, lui, cherche son gagne-pain, mais il profite, en fait, comment on appelle ça, d'une opportunité de crise, d'une situation, en fait. Donc, tant qu'il y aura cette situation de crise, je veux dire, ça reste une opportunité pour les passeurs de pouvoir faire leur business et ils sont prêts à tout pour gagner leur argent. Mais en même temps, la victime, la vraie victime, en fait, qui est derrière, se trouve non seulement victime de cette personne qui est venue lui donner des idées plein la tête, mais aussi victime des structures qui ne sont pas capables de le protéger, de ne pas atteindre ces objectifs-là, qui seront après néfastes pour lui. Donc, je ne sais pas si j'ai répondu, mais...
Oui, merci. Thank you, Josène. The reason why, and I'll switch back to English just to make sure that I'm clear enough, but the reason why...
Je peux répondre, juste dire un mot?
Ah non. Oui, s'il vous plaît, allez-y.
I can? I will speak, I will tell really quickly. Yeah? Just feedback for our friend Ayman, and it will be in Arabic. إذا أنا فقط آسف أنك تقريبا أسقطت 90% يا عماد من ما قلته، باعتبار أني قلت أن المسؤولية الكبرى 90% من المسؤولية تقع على السياسات، على التمييز وعلى غياب العدالة في الثروة وفي السياسات، وركزت على سلوكات الحكومات شمال أفريقيا وحكومات الاتحاد الأوروبي في يعني منع وغلق الحدود، وقلت أن هذه مسؤوليات عامة، ولكن وقلت أنه كذلك على مستوى العائلات يجب أن تتحمل مسؤوليته، وإحنا عندما نبحث عن الحلول يجب أن نعرف من هم المسؤولين. هذا إذن فقط أنا أريد أن أقول لك لأنك في الحقيقة أسقطت وظلمتني وتحدثت فقط عن مسؤولية الأمهات والعائلات، بينما أنا قلت أن 90% من المسؤوليات تقع على الحكومات وعلى السياسات وعلى غياب العدالة في المنطقة المتوسطية. وعندنا منطقة متوسطية اللي هي مبدئيا اتفاقية برشلونة تقول بأن الشراكة في الازدهار. أين هي الشراكة في الازدهار؟ لا نراها. غلق الحدود، أصبحت الهجرة يعني حرب على المهاجرين وحرب على المجتمعات وغلق للحدود، بينما المطلوب هو يعني تعاون. وحتى يعني العهد الدولي الجديد للمنظمة الدولية للهجرة وعلى مستوى المتحدة يهدف إلى أن تكون الهجرة يعني ليست حل وليست مشكل، بينما ما نراه اليوم في المنطقة المتوسطية وأن الهجرة أصبحت مشكل. إذن هذا الجانب الذي أردت أن أرد به مباشرة حتى لا يقع اتهامي بأني يعني لا أنا أتحدث عن حلول وتفكير شامل global. إذن le deuxième élément par rapport auquel je voudrais juste dire quelque chose, c'est que je veux dire dans les pays, et ça c'est par rapport à l'intervention de José, nous voyons que, je veux dire, au niveau de la Tunisie, si je prends l'exemple tunisien, les lois, entre autres la loi de 2004, elle touche plus les migrants que les trafiquants. Et à un certain moment, surtout avant 2011, ce sont les migrants qui sont les victimes de l'application de la loi par les cours, alors que les trafiquants sont moins. Nous sommes en train de s'orienter vers une plus grande sévérité des juges contre les réseaux de migrants, les réseaux de trafiquants. La même chose, la Tunisie n'a pas une loi sur l'asile. La Tunisie et les pays d'Afrique du Nord, qui sont une partie de cette problématique générale, n'ont pas des politiques qui respectent le droit des migrants au sens du traité, je veux dire, et de la Convention de 1990. Donc c'est normal que nous avons toutes ces défaillances, tous ces écarts, toutes ces injustices contre, je veux dire, toutes les franges de la société. Et je terminerai par dire que le problème, c'est que aussi bien en Libye qu'en Tunisie, les réseaux de trafic sont animés par des gens, 80 ou 90%, ce sont des trafiquants de la même nationalité ou de la même région. Le Mixed Migration Center a publié en 2018, je crois, une étude où il a démontré que les routes migratoires vers la Libye et les autres trafiquants sont tenus pour l'Afrique de l'Est par des Érythréens, par des Éthiopiens. Pour l'Afrique de l'Ouest, ce sont des Nigériens, ce sont des Maliens qui tiennent, ce sont les animateurs et les responsables des réseaux. Et la même chose en Tunisie. On a vu que, je veux dire, tous les drames qui sont réalisés depuis 2 ou 3 ans, qui ont eu lieu depuis 3 ans avec les drames, les noyades en mer, je veux dire des drames qui touchent toutes les zones de Tunisie, ce sont des trafiquants et des trafiquants tunisiens qui ne sont pas assez. Je veux dire, l'État a fait beaucoup d'efforts. Nous avons vu beaucoup d'arrestations, de réseaux, de responsables, mais doit y avoir une plus grande gouvernance, une meilleure gouvernance, une plus grande transparence dans la gestion, je veux dire, de la loi contre les trafiquants et pas contre les migrants. Voilà ce que je voulais dire. Merci.
Merci, merci Boubakri.
Boubakri.
Boubakri. C'est ça que j'avais dit. Alors, are there
Marzia, you are muted. We cannot hear you.
I'm sorry, of course, I was on mute. Now it's me being on mute. Are there any other questions, any other comments from attendees to our panelists about what was presented earlier before moving on maybe to other questions that I may like to all of our participants? Yes, we have Edward.
Oui.
Yeah.
Okay.
نحب نقول No, excuse me. Excuse me, sorry, Mr. Mr. Dwyer, so I would ask him to take the floor first. Excuse me.
Thank you very much. Just, can you hear me?
Loud and clear, yes.
Yeah, lovely. I was just very interested in some of the advocacy for, you know, the whole visa issue and how Europe should reflect on serious policy reform around visas and freedom of movement and you know, this whole global approach to freedom of movement, which would indeed be ideal if it could happen. But do the panelists think that, you know, if you consider how the European Union operates and its expansion, inclusion of other countries, there's a whole series of steps that the qualification to become a member and have that freedom of movement, you know, it goes through a whole series of steps of I suppose quality control, just to make sure that certain things are in place that before this freedom of movement actually takes effect. And then Europe's relationship with neighboring countries then has it's not the same obviously, but it has a neighborhood policy, and there it seeks to have a common, as we understand it, a common approach to various, you know, economic and social issues that would allow a complementarity on both sides. Do you think that those issues, do the panel think that those issues should be addressed in parallel with this freedom of movement and the issue of visas, and how, you know, would they have any proposals on that front? Over.
Can I respond for two quick? I think one way to tackle that question is to, you know, problematize that not doing these broader structural changes is ineffective, and that we've been, you know, that's how we have been doing it. So to answer that question, we need to take a look at what's not working currently, right? And then the other thing is, I wanted to just highlight that the freedom of movement, if it's on the table, that it can take small steps, like you said, but it's not at the table yet. And that's why I highlighted earlier the small cooperative projects that Mr. Vincent Cochetel mentioned. So that's, you know, that aligns with that idea as a first step. Cooperative projects between different countries.
Thank you very much, Odessa.
Spoken from someone who is not an expert in the region, of course.
هل لي أن أتدخل في هذا؟ أنا نحب نقول، هل في إمكان العالم أن ينظر إلى مسألة الهجرة اللانظامية مسألة إنسانية؟ لأنه مسألة الهجرة اللانظامية أصبحت سياسة. كل أوروبا وكل حكومات الأوروبية إذا أرادوا المر ويأخذوا الحكم ويريدوا يحكموا يلزم يضغط بملف الهجرة اللانظامية. هو يقولوا باش نضربوا المهاجرين، باش نسكروا على المهاجرين، ولا ملف الهجرة أصبح سياسيا وفقدنا منه الإنسانية. هل هناك إمكانية أن نضع ملف الهجرة اللانظامية في الأمور الإنسانية ويبتعد على السياسة؟ سوف نجد الحل. أما مدام السياسيين إن كانوا في تونس والاتحاد الأوروبي ينظروا إلى ملف الهجرة ملف سياسي لن نجد حل. الحل الوحيد هو نظر إلى الهجرة اللانظامية بنظرية إنسانية. هنالك ناس قاعدة تموت كل يوم في الماء، هنالك البحر الأبيض المتوسط أصبح مقبرة جماعية، هنالك السمك أصبح يأكل البشر والبشر لم يعد يأكل السمك لغلاء السمك. هل نقدر يوم ننظر إليه في نظرية إنسانية؟ سوف نجد حل. أما السياسيين إن كان في تونس أو الاتحاد الأوروبي ملف الهجرة هو ملف سياسي بامتياز. ولذلك نحن باعتقادنا إذا مازلنا نغزروا له في منظور سياسي لن نجد حل، لن نجد حل. ولكن أرجوكم ثم أرجوكم ثم أرجوكم، ملف الهجرة هو ملف إنساني. شكرا.
Thank you, Mr. Sultani. I think we all agree that there are humanitarian implications, that are also implications on many other in many other ways. And I think you know what perhaps also the question by Mr. Dwyer was referring to is that perhaps we need to move beyond this closed borders, open borders sort of dichotomy and debate towards what can actually be done in a relatively short term to expand legal pathways in a ways that also make sure that the dangers that the migrants go through can be diminished. And I think we also have to look at not only what is not working, but also what is perhaps working and what could be working, right? And there are also policies being put in place. I'm thinking, for instance, of skills partnerships when it comes to easing also pathways for regular migration and skilled migration at all levels between Northern African countries and Europe. But this goes beyond, right? We have to address the whole complexity of mixed migration movements. And perhaps if you allow me to go back to sort of what the key focus of this panel was about, and maybe provide some quick final observations to also close this panel. I think there are three key points that emerged from the presentations and from the discussions that we've had. One is that we really need to nuance the discourse on migrant smuggling and get away from this savior versus perpetrator type of dichotomy and simplistic views of mobility facilitation process in Libya and beyond. And as part of that, we have looked exactly also at this question, and this workshop is also looking at this question in a recent edited volume that we published as IOM, also with contributions from the research of the Mixed Migration Center. And there's particular one chapter looks, at the people behind migrants' journeys and intermediaries and smugglers that are often men, women, and children from marginalized and impoverished communities who have historically also relied on the provision of mobility and transportation services to generate income, perhaps for their own migration project or just to reduce the impact of poverty. And this has, we keep talking about the need to nuance the debate on smuggling, but this has real implications for policy and what it means to actually counter smuggling, right? And it might be, I think the challenge is not really recognizing this, but moving towards what it means to actually incorporate these nuances into more sort of effective policies to counter smuggling, but also facilitate safe, orderly, and regular migration. And humanitarian channels, obviously, for migration, for asylum seekers. And this is also linked to the concept of irregularity that I was going back to in my questions to José and in our interpretation of these journeys, which particularly when it comes to migration within West Africa more broadly, or from Western Africa to the Sahel region and to North Africa, is really historic, has historical and deeply rooted origins. And also, I think one of the points mentioned in one of the previous panels would be to understand, this dynamics is important, but how do we translate this into evidence, into counter-smuggling policies, protection, assistance, development that incorporate all of these aspects into this holistic approach. So what do these holistic approaches actually look like? Do we have good examples maybe of this from what is actually being done on countries along this route? What is this route-based approach to protection assistance policies and counter-smuggling policies on the Central Mediterranean route? And obviously, I don't have the answers, and these are, I think, questions that remain open, but that we will need to address in order to really tackle the complexity of this and make sure that, again, counter-smuggling policies are humane and not endanger migrants or smugglers alike, as we've seen. I think the second point is that we need to really understand the consequences of tighter policies, border control policies and restrictive policies on the risks and vulnerabilities faced by migrants using smuggling services, and ensure that these policies do not, again, further endanger people on the move. One of the key objectives of this Global Compact for Safe Orderly Migration is make migration safe and not only regular, but what happens when this push against irregularity actually pushes people into unsafe conditions. So we have to look at these contrasting objectives. And then there's also the point about whether these approaches to counter-smuggling and stricter approaches to border policies have actually contributed to also engineering a more sophisticated criminal organization around human smuggling, which might have been, again, just facilitation of journeys before numbers started rising, before this approach to border control on this route began being implemented. And so are we getting the causal link right? Are we looking exactly at how these criminal organizations may have been exacerbated by policies that aim to restrict movement on this route? And then third and last point, and now I'll pass over to Ayla for the closing of the session. I think there is clearly a link between smugglers and facilitators and the missing migrants, identification, assistance to families who are missing the loved ones. And we have to make sure that focusing too much on irregularity and countering smuggling does not also prevent efforts to trace and identify migrants who have gone missing, and making sure that they can actually that there is more focus on also on the need to assist families of missing migrants and provide some closure to families of missing migrants. I would leave it at that, and I will pass over to Ayla. Well, thank you very much. Thank you to all our panelists for the very interesting presentations, all the comments, questions that were made, and thanks again. Over to you, Ayla.
Thank you very much, Marzia. So I would like to start this wrap-up session. Well, first, I'd like to welcome Emma, who will be taking live visual notes during this session to share her screen. And while she's doing that, I'd like to just provide a bit of context for what we're about to do. This is the first day, but we'll be doing this at the end of each day. And what we envisioned for these wrap-up sessions was to have an opportunity to bring together all of the key recommendations, insights, points for advocacy or policy reform that were mentioned in the two panels and keynotes of the day, and to really synthesize them into some visual notes that we can keep a record of throughout the full workshop. And in the final session of the workshop on day 3, we will have a longer wrap-up where we want to kind of put together the summation of all of these key recommendations into a kind of plan, if you will, that we would like all participants to then validate for us to be able to take forward as we go through the dissemination strategy for this workshop. So while Emma is sharing, I will begin to now list the key recommendations that I've taken note of, and then open it up to the group to add further points that I might have missed. So first, I think most importantly, it's important for us to, a key point made by Vincent Cochetel during the first keynote is that as we approach certain borders, we see protection violations increase and exploitation increase. The distinction becomes less clear between these two groups that we're looking at, and the dynamics that define trafficking versus smuggling. I see that we're having some difficulty with the screen sharing. So I will give Emma a few more seconds to get this started. All right, we'll give her a little bit of time. I will, in fact, as we do this, here we go. Any luck? No. All right. Well, we can continue. So with this in mind, this blurring distinction in mind, the following recommendations were made first and foremost by our moderator, Joost Klarenbeek, to have some kind of platform for more information sharing. Then Vincent Cochetel went on to say that we should be focusing on these key spots rather than spreading ourselves too thin. Suggestions were made around Sudan, Mali, and Niger, where we could develop these smaller cooperation projects and more holistic ones, which was a theme that ran through all of the interventions during that panel, as did the need for longer term solutions and investments. And that victims need to be recognized for their protection needs, but also as witnesses of a key crime. As the first panel progressed, we looked at how coordination could be improved between NGOs and authority, and that training across the board was something that was called for. In addition, having child-sensitive training was of particular importance, and ensuring this training, but as well as victim identification at all border points, and that trafficking should feature in grounds or as part of grounds for international protection. An additional recommendation made was that we need to do a lot more to help countries like Italy, Spain, Greece, and Malta. Then we move on to the case of the Netherlands, where we looked at this requirement to show evidence on the part of victims of trafficking and finding alternative mechanisms to this requirement to share evidence. Other recommendations. Long-term solutions, again, are a policy blind spot. We need to provide alternatives to reintegration when reintegration does not seem feasible or as an appropriate option. And we have to find funding for longer-term follow-ups with victims. Follow-ups are not a part of many policies, and in some countries they are discouraged. I think there are 10 questions are something that we want to also take more of a look at and think about these unintended consequences when designing policies. A key point that was emphasized over and again by Sarah and by Megan was this structural level and the level of proximate causes that we seem to be missing out on. And in this way, I think their questions provided us a toolkit. And one thing, or one question that was raised is, how do we adopt this more holistic perspective, and what tools could be recommended to policy for doing so? Then, as we move to the next panel, our second panel on smuggling, we again, this issue of structural and proximate causes returned, because we looked at the fact that we could not criminalize smuggling without increasing legal pathways for movement. So recognizing how all these systems are interconnected, and without taking to task the structural global inequalities that produce the need for and shape the dynamics of these smuggling structures, if you will, and that legal frameworks should distinguish between different roles within smuggling networks, since we saw from the presentations how different the different roles were, and that often the actors that are the most visible sometimes have the least amount of power and are really blurred in the different functions they undertake. For instance, with some refugees and migrants having to participate in the sector because it could be the only one that they have access to from an employment perspective. Then finally, increase access to information about immigration and visa policies, and putting families at the center, or working with families at the center of policies. And I think this last panel also illuminated the perceptions on both sides of the Mediterranean can also stand as obstacles to develop policies that are sensitive to the complexity that we've discussed over the course of today, including the longer term nature of policies. So that was just a brief wrap up of the recommendations. If I could invite those in the room to also chip in more from any part of the panels that we've discussed. Over. I'm looking for any raised hands. Yes, please go ahead, Georgia.
Yeah, thanks very much, Isla. I do think that Sarah and Megan, I don't think they're any longer here. But the point that they raise, which is about how much of this is really new and how much of this knowledge is things that we've known versions of for a long time. How much of this knowledge is things that we have already had extensive research on, and then with us stuck in a cycle of policy. And what is actually needed in order to cause that change? Is it more of this kind of iterative, incremental knowledge production, or what is going to cause the actual shifts in policy, and the need to have an honest conversation about where and how research is able to contribute towards that change is something that's important to bear in mind, I think, over the course of this workshop. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks very much, Georgia. And this is a point just to add on about how do we operationalize all of it? And speaking to your question, there were two kind of hypotheses put out. Was it that is it the structural interests that we're not taking to task, or are we saying that the issues are too complex, and that is what is preventing us from operationalizing it? Thank you very much for that intervention. Does anyone else want to come in?
Hi there. Hi, I just
Please.
wanted to also add about the global lens, because the same thing's happening in the North America and Mexico and that region of, and so it speaks to the, to the larger province, and it's not regional. There's specifics about regions, but there's also commonalities across these two spaces, for instance, in the Sonoran Desert. And I know that there are some advocates like Ahmed and Caravan Migrant who work in both areas, in Latin America and Mexico and in Tunisia. And so if if it might be fruitful to also have that exchange of ideas with that part of the world and what's happening in those routes, migration routes.
Thank you very much for that point, Odessa, on how sometimes looking to other regions can also inform the work that we are all engaged in the Mediterranean. I think that point was also raised when we look towards the Middle East and also seeing the interconnections between different regions, and that's something that we'll be taking. We'll be putting on the table in discussions when we look at regional policy processes. Thank you. Would anyone else like to jump into the discussion? Yes. Please go ahead, Alice. We are not hearing you, even though you're unmuted. Nothing yet.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for all the information, all the presentation. I really appreciated them. Something I found interesting in this morning presentation was the attempt to make a link also with programming and the role of donors. In all the discussion we have been having, I think that the insight into the specific and contextual dynamics of trafficking and smuggling are so important that I know it's challenging to bridge the link between research and programming, but even more with advocacy with the donor and with clear recommendation that could guide and steer the process from the donor side in trying to negotiate with partners and for the programs relating to smuggling and trafficking. So in the wrap-up sessions would have also focus on specific recommendation that would be highly appreciated. Thank you. Over.
Is there any particular intervention that you would like to push to reflect on these implications, Alice?
I think that what is missing the most at the donor level is the understanding of the various differences of the different contexts, the different role of the society, the community, the family, also the very fluid roles that we can observe. We have been hearing a lot, and I fully agree with the fact that people experience different roles in different parts of the journey. And these are things that are really difficult at the donor level to try to elaborate and be able to negotiate partnership that makes sense, that do not focus only on some of the measures that we know can be effective or cannot be effective or even harmful sometimes, but are really needed to take informed decision on where to allocate money. Thank you.
Thank you very much for expanding. Eddie, please chime in.
Yeah, it was just a question for Marzia. If you could just, you made the point on the need to nuance the discourse on irregular migration, and it was very nicely done. If you could just maybe repeat that again, your first point. You said there were 3 points, and that was the first point you made. If you could just go over the nuance that you meant there, because I think that's an important one. Over.
Thank you very much, Edward. Yes, yes, this point, again, as I said, is coming back over and over again, because when we think about, irregular migration and smuggling, we have this sort of monolithic understanding of what this means. But as all the presentations and the work done by the Mixed Migration Center and colleagues also from the DTM is showing is really the dynamics that show that we have to look at it within, so we have to look at smuggling within the broader socioeconomic context in which it emerges, right? And so one of the aspects that I was highlighting, which also came through the analysis that we did in this edited volume on migration in Western North Africa across the Mediterranean, is that smugglers, really what we think of, these big criminal organizations are often just individuals. And I think the point was also made this morning, individuals who are trying to make a living with the few opportunities that are available to them. And one of them is, and not just in recent times, I mean, has been for, at least since introduction of borders, in Africa and across the Sahel, the facilitation of journeys as the facilitation of travel services, and for people wanting to move, mainly for economic reasons, but not only. So we're talking about really facilitation of journeys and mixed migration journeys across these borders. And so this, goes back to also what Ala was saying about the need to distinguish within the smuggling, this understanding of smuggling between different individuals who have different roles, and also the context in which smuggling emerges and has existed, and what are the alternatives, and what are the economic structures, what is the situation of marginalization and impoverishment that may make smuggling or facilitation of journeys the only alternative available to people in some of these key locations and key sort of transit locations across the Central and Western Mediterranean routes, for instance. That's, I think, was pretty much what I was mentioning, but then this complexity is also emerges within the smuggling dynamics when, we talk about different individuals having different roles, and where often the most visible individuals in terms of, the facilitators, the négociateurs, are actually the ones at the end of the chain who, are just, the last link in this sort of bigger organizations around the facilitation, particularly across Mediterranean boat crossings. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Marzia. I'd like to also pick up a point raised in the comments by Dr. Gauci about the way we assess success in the context of this programming, and how this also relates to the point raised by engaging donors. And I think two of the presentations from our first panel really tied into this with Sarah and Megan's presentation, saying, I'm putting it glibly, but that there are no appealing numbers associated with prevention. And so when you target people at high risk rather than people who've already become victims, then you are you don't have the same appeal of these numbers potentially. And secondly, Ms. Dalmar Hamid's intervention spoke of a situation in 2018 in the Netherlands where numbers were increasing, and this was interpreted, numbers of victims of trafficking were increasing, and this was interpreted as a sign that things were not working and as a need for a policy shift, when in fact it signified the opposite. Because victims felt comfortable coming forward and reporting their cases. So perhaps I can invite Dr. Gauci to maybe expand on this a bit further if you'd like. Over.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add, to be honest, but I think this idea of linking to donors, which Alicia mentioned, is critically important. And in that, how do we measure success, both in the kind of big frame, but also in the day-to-day reporting to funders from our programming, and how that is linked to certain types of numbers as opposed to other types of numbers and other types of data, which may or may not be available. But obviously, as long as the kind of success indicators remain what they are, then the outcomes we are working towards are likely to remain what they are without changing. And I think starting from the funders and what funders require as success is likely to result in possibly one of the more important levers for change. moving forward.
Thank you for this comment. So both as something to critique, but then as something that we can use as a source of power in improving our programming by using it as a lever. I think that's a really key point. Thank you very much. We also have a point made by Odessa on the fact that taking to task these structural factors as well as individual factors are not necessarily mutually exclusive. And so again, a big theme of today really has been this holistic approach that programs should and can take. I think can is the key point here, that it's not impossible. And so reflecting on things like from our first panel, cultural norms or social norms, gender dynamics, and how interventions need to be sensitive to them, so that in a context of reintegration, we are not just reigniting the cycle, also to pick up on Johanna's point. Can I invite anyone else to take the mic? You don't have to raise your hand. You can come in now if you like, or the person who's raised the comment in the chat, if you also would like to say it.
C'est José. Hein. Il y a l'OIM, je pense des années 2014, si je ne me trompe pas, qui avait fait un projet de financement de micro-projets pour ceux qui veulent rentrer, pour les retours volontaires, les personnes qui sont venues, qui se sont retrouvées, entre guillemets, prises au piège de cette migration clandestine et qui se sont découragés entre-temps, qui voulaient bien retourner chez eux, mais qui étaient comme aussi piégés dans le sens où ils ont claqué toutes leurs économies dans ce voyage, mais en même temps ne savaient plus comment faire pour faire marche arrière. Alors, l'OIM a lancé un truc très magnifique, le financement de micro-projets pour ceux qui veulent bien rentrer. Et ça a encouragé, on a remarqué que ces années-là, il y avait beaucoup de personnes qui prenaient l'initiative de rentrer chez eux parce qu'ils avaient l'impression qu'enfin, ils vont rentrer, mais pas pour ne rien faire, mais pour faire réellement quelque chose qu'ils ont besoin. Et ça poussait les gens à se lancer dans l'entrepreneuriat. Des personnes qui se déplaçaient sans objectif, qui se retrouvaient, entre guillemets, qui avaient l'impression que leur vie ne servait plus à rien, mais qui se retrouvent du jour au lendemain avec un objectif. Ça a un peu réveillé de l'espoir en ces personnes-là. Ils ont commencé à croire en eux réellement et ils sont lancés dans des projets incroyables. Il y a même certaines personnes encore aujourd'hui, on peut lire leurs témoignages, qui sont aujourd'hui dans leur pays et qui font réellement une vraie activité. Et ces personnes-là, si on leur dit aujourd'hui, relancez-vous encore dans la migration, je ne pense pas qu'ils accepteront. Donc, je pense que ça fait aussi partie des stratégies qu'il ne faut pas négliger parce qu'entre-temps, c'est vrai, il y a eu, les raisons ont été énoncées comme quoi manque de financement et tout, mais c'est des solutions qui ont été, pour ma part, j'ai remarqué que ça a été vraiment très bien pour contrecarrer ce fléau de migration clandestine. Juste préciser que ce financement, en réalité, actuellement, n'est plus vraiment valable. Ça veut dire qu'il y a plein de personnes aujourd'hui qui se retrouvent dans la même situation et qui auraient bien voulu s'investir à faire quelque chose, mais qui n'ont pas cette possibilité-là parce que ce n'est plus vraiment ouvert comme avant.
Merci, José. Could I ask Fergus Peace to perhaps say your comment about this interesting crossover that you've noted? Over.
Thank you, Ayla. Yes, I just thought there are a few points in the discussion across the day. So we mentioned this morning, the prospects of maybe smaller cooperative projects as a starting point for some of this policy reform. And then we've also heard a few times about places, local areas where it may be that the only economic opportunities for a migrant or for a local is somehow related to the smuggling and trafficking industry. And I think there's perhaps an opportunity there to address some of those really local economic issues, because I think that's something where programming can help create alternatives in a local economy, whereas as I think Johanna and Sarah and Megan said this morning, trying to do development on the national scale and address root causes writ large is very difficult. But you can, I think, try to do something in local communities that are highly dependent on smuggling and trafficking to create some alternatives. But I would just say also as a caveat that I know there are some projects attempting to do things like that in Niger, which have not worked so well. So it's an area to be kind of cautious about, but hopefully something where, that sort of smaller scale local project can open up opportunities that trying to go straight to the national level and the bigger scale would make very difficult. Thanks.
Thank you, Fergus. And Georgia has just raised an important point, which is I hope that we come back to this idea that you've raised, because on day 3, Janina Sterner and Lionel Nzamba have a presentation on the role of cities and municipal authorities in addressing these issues on a localized scale, but also connecting to larger regional processes. It's on Wednesday morning, so it's a sneak peek. Eddie, let's go back over to you. Over.
Sorry to be asking so many, but it's just to know if the panel has any sort of recommendations for state-to-state dialogue. I mean, yes, we see what the humanitarian or the international organizations should be doing. What about state-to-state? What should they be talking about? Is there any, maybe 1 or 2 messages on that? Over. North Africa states, Europeans, Europe states, Sub-Saharan states, North African states, etc.
Thank you for your question. Can we have any of the day's speakers chime in on this? Or perhaps Professor Boubakri, you would also like to comment on the question of what opportunities there are for state-to-state dialogue on these topics that we've raised.
Je peux.
Thank you.
I can, yes. Yes. Je crois que il y a 2 cadres qui peuvent, je veux dire, servir de dialogue interétatique. Mais bon, il faut qu'il y ait la volonté d'abord. La volonté, la clarté ou la clarté dans les objectifs et les perspectives. Parce que tout à l'heure, quand j'avais parlé, tout à l'heure, mon ami Imad Sultani a cru que j'attaquais uniquement les familles, alors que moi, j'avais dit que les États sont les principaux responsables, les politiques sont les principaux responsables, les décideurs sont les principaux responsables, et nous avons des cadres qui sont, je veux dire, prêts, ready. Nous avons, au niveau de l'Union africaine, il y a beaucoup de dynamique dans la libre circulation. Ces dynamiques sont très pertinentes au sud du Sahara, mais entre les communautés économiques régionales, regional communities, south of Sahara, ce qui n'est pas le cas au nord, dans le sens nord-sud. Nous avons un manque de dialogue entre le groupement ou la région de l'Afrique du Nord, des pays d'Afrique du Nord, dans le dialogue sur la manière de gérer la mobilité des personnes dans le moyen et le long terme, sans parler du court terme. Et normalement, je veux dire, les pays d'Afrique du Nord ont beaucoup intérêt, c'est ce que j'avais toujours dit, à ne pas cloner les politiques migratoires européennes appliquées par les États membres de l'Union européenne vis-à-vis des ressortissants des pays nord-africains. Donc, il y a comme je l'ai dit, il faudrait réfléchir à la manière de gérer et je veux dire, d'anticiper les politiques de la gestion de la mobilité et de la circulation des personnes, déjà entre ces grands ensembles régionaux des pays tiers. Toute l'Afrique, ce sont des pays tiers vis-à-vis de l'Union européenne. Et donc, de l'autre côté, je veux dire, il y a la relation entre l'Union européenne et les pays d'Afrique du Nord, qui en fait participent à un doublement des difficultés et des atteintes dont sont victimes les migrants, dans la mesure où les pays européens, nos voisins du Nord, nous sommes leurs voisins du Sud, mais eux sont nos voisins du Nord et nous avons nos voisins au sud du Sahara et nous sommes au milieu et il faudrait que nous ayons des relations qui sont gouvernées par le New Pact of Migration, sur le nouveau pacte de la migration de l'ONU, basé sur des migrations ordonnées et humaines. Et là, on ne voit pas le cas parce qu'en fait, avec l'Union européenne, les relations entre les pays d'Afrique du Nord et l'Union européenne sont des relations je veux dire, de dominant et de dominé. On ne peut pas, je veux dire, le nier ni le cacher. On le voit bien. Et normalement, je veux dire, l'un des moyens ou des outils les plus efficaces, c'est d'ouvrir la possibilité d'une plus grande mobilité, je dirais libre circulation, mais on en arrivera un jour, mais pas tout de suite, mais au moins entrouvrir plus de possibilités pour que les ressortissants des pays africains et surtout nord-africains puissent accéder au marché de la formation et de l'emploi en Europe. Sinon, on va continuer à produire et à donner raison aux trafiquants et au réseau de traite pour qu'ils continuent à exploiter la volonté des ressortissants du Sud pour aller vers le Nord. Donc, pour résumer, pour ne pas, nous sommes à la fin de la séance, je dirais, la volonté, le courage de la part
Professor Boubakri,
de
could
ces
I ask
pays.
you
Merci.
to just wrap up in a minute? Thank you. Sorry for intervening, but we've just reached the end of our time. So could I just ask you to finish your last point?
Qui? Ah, d'accord. OK. D'accord. Oui, oui, non, je disais que, je veux dire, cette rencontre, les débats que nous avons eus aujourd'hui, je veux dire, est un message très fort vis-à-vis des États pour qu'elles jouent leur rôle, que ce soit des États au niveau individuel, bilatéral ou multilatéral en tant que groupements régionaux. Et je veux dire, réfléchir à une manière plus humaine, plus transparente, plus ouverte pour gérer la mobilité. Et mieux on gère la mobilité, mieux la mobilité et la migration sont gouvernées, moins nous avons des problèmes plus on ferme les portes et on bloque les réseaux de trafiquants et de traite. Voilà mon message. Merci.
Thank you very much. So we've now come to the end of our day, our program. You'll see our technical glitch with our visual notes. They're not live updated, but it is happening in the background. So we just wanted to show you a picture of what it looked like halfway through, which we will make available later this evening. So you'll have time to see it before we begin tomorrow. I want to thank everyone, particularly all of the speakers and the panelists and all of the attendees for the fantastic questions today, for your time, and really for all of the key recommendations. I've written 5 pages of just all of the recommendations that we got today. So we're off to a fantastic start. Tomorrow we begin at 9 a.m. sharp. And the full day, the theme for tomorrow is really to focus on protection in contexts of mixed movement and all of its complexities. So I'd just like to ask my colleagues from UNHCR, perhaps Eddie O'Dwyer or Vincent Cochetel, if you'd like to say any words of final summation, please, the floor is yours before we close.
Over to you, Eddie.
Okay, thanks, Vincent. Well, I think Ida has said it all. It's been a really rich day in reflection. I think, thank you very, very much. Thank you to Vincent for a very engaging opening, I think. I think that really set the scene and used as well in terms of, you know, that he's very good at moderation this morning. And Marzia as well, and to everybody. So I think, as Ida said, we have many questions. I found it extremely interesting and insightful and provocative in terms of, you know, of where we need to go from here. I think it's the first day. We have more to come tomorrow and the day after, and by the time we reach the end of our 3 days, I think we will have certainly a very rich body of work to move forward with. So thank you very much on behalf of our colleagues here, and thank you to you, Ayla, and your team. Really well done today. Over.
Thanks, everyone, and have a good evening. See you tomorrow at 9 sharp.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Au revoir tout le monde. À demain. Salam à Ahmed.